The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty parking lot of Ridgeline Hardware as Elena Vasquez unlocked the heavy glass doors for another day. At 53, she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to make every motion count. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her weathered hands bore the calluses of 20 years spent helping contractors, farmers, and weekend warriors find exactly what they needed to fix, build, or repair their worlds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Most people who walked into Ridgeline Hardware saw exactly what they expected to see: a middle-aged woman in worn jeans and a flannel shirt, someone who could probably help them find the right size screws or recommend a decent paint brand, but nothing more. They noticed her patient smile when explaining the difference between wood screws and drywall anchors, her careful attention to detail when measuring pipe fittings, and the way she somehow always knew exactly where to find that one specific part they needed. What they didn't notice was the way her eyes automatically cataloged sightlines and cover positions, or how she instinctively positioned herself with clear exits whenever strangers entered her store. Elena had opened Ridgeline Hardware after her discharge from the Army, using her military savings and a small business loan to create something that felt like home. The store occupied a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Millbrook, a small town that served as a gateway to the Cascade Mountains. Her customers were a mix of locals who'd known her for years and outdoor enthusiasts passing through on their way to hiking trails and hunting grounds. She'd built a reputation for fair prices, quality merchandise, and the kind of old-fashioned customer service that seemed to be disappearing from the world. The store itself reflected Elena's personality: organized, efficient, and unpretentious. Rows of precisely labeled shelves held everything from basic household items to specialized outdoor gear. The walls were decorated with vintage hardware advertisements and a few subtle military memorabilia pieces that most visitors assumed were just decorative. A small American flag hung behind the register, and a faded photo of a much younger Elena in military dress uniform sat discreetly on a shelf, usually obscured by inventory paperwork. What her customers didn't know was that Elena Vasquez had spent 12 years as a U.S. Army sniper, with 3 combat deployments and a classified service record that would have surprised anyone who knew her only as the helpful hardware store owner. She'd earned her expert marksmanship badge before most people her age had learned to drive, and her military personnel file contained commendations that few soldiers ever achieved. But Elena had left that life behind deliberately, choosing the quiet satisfaction of civilian service over the recognition that might have come with staying in uniform. The transformation hadn't been easy. After her final deployment, Elena had struggled with the transition that many veterans faced: the challenge of finding purpose and identity outside the military structure that had defined her adult life. Opening the hardware store had been her way of continuing to serve, helping people solve problems and build things instead of engaging targets from impossible distances. She'd found peace in the routine of inventory management, customer service, and the simple satisfaction of helping someone complete a project successfully. Her days followed a comfortable pattern. She arrived early, usually before sunrise, to receive deliveries and organize the day's priorities. The morning rush brought contractors picking up supplies for job sites, followed by the steady stream of homeowners working on weekend projects. Afternoons were quieter, giving her time to update inventory, order special items, and help customers with more complex questions. She closed at 6, spent an hour updating her books, and went home to her small house on the edge of town, where she tended a garden and read books about subjects that had nothing to do with military tactics or precision shooting. The trouble started on a Thursday morning in late September when the Marine unit arrived in Millbrook for what their commanding officer called wilderness training exercises. Camp Leoin had sent 2 squads to conduct a week-long field exercise in the national forest that bordered the town, and the Marines had been granted permission to use the abandoned airfield outside Millbrook as their base of operations. It was the kind of training deployment that looked good in reports and gave urban Marines experience with rural terrain. But it also meant that 24 young men with military bearing and attitude were suddenly loose in a small town with limited entertainment options. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison led the first group that wandered into Ridgeline Hardware. At 28, Morrison was career military with the confidence that came from leading men in combat, and the swagger that came from believing his uniform made him special. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, earned his fair share of commendations, and had developed a reputation as one of the finest marksmen in his unit. The Marines who followed him, Corporals Danny Chun, Miguel Santos, and Tyler Brooks, were younger but shared their sergeant's conviction that civilian life was soft, predictable, and inferior to the brotherhood they'd found in the corps. They entered Elena's store like they were conducting a patrol, spreading out to cover the aisles and speaking in the loud, confident voices of men who were used to being the most dangerous people in any room. Morrison approached the counter where Elena was processing a delivery invoice, his eyes scanning the store with the automatic assessment of someone trained to evaluate threats and opportunities. "Morning, ma'am," Morrison said, his tone polite, but carrying the subtle condescension that some military personnel reserve for civilians. "We're with the Marines, conducting training exercises in the area. Heard you might have some of the supplies we need." Elena looked up from her paperwork, taking in the 4 men who'd entered her store. She recognized the type: immediately young Marines who'd probably seen some action, proud of their service, and convinced that their military experience made them superior to the civilians they'd sworn to protect. She'd worked with men like these during her own service, some of whom had been excellent soldiers despite their attitudes, others who'd been more bluster than substance. "Of course," Elena replied, her voice carrying the same patient tone she used with all her customers. "What can I help you find?" Morrison pulled out a handwritten list. "We need rope, about 200 feet of climbing grade. Carabiners, the heavy-duty kind. Some tarps, waterproof if you have them. And we're looking for targets for our shooting range setup." Elena nodded, already mentally cataloging where each item could be found. "I can help with most of that. The rope is aisle 4. Carabiners are with the climbing gear near the back. Tarps are on the left wall, and I've got paper targets behind the counter. But if you need something more specialized, I can order it." "Paper targets should work fine," Morrison said, glancing around the store again. "We're just doing some basic marksmanship training. Nothing too challenging for a small-town setup." There was something in his tone that made Elena look up from the list she was reviewing. Morrison was studying the military memorabilia on her walls with the expression of someone who'd spotted something interesting but wasn't quite sure what to make of it. His eyes lingered on the photograph of Elena in uniform, but from his angle, he couldn't see the details clearly enough to understand what he was looking at. "You serve?" Morrison asked, nodding toward the photo. "Long time ago," Elena replied, not offering additional details. She'd learned that most people weren't really interested in her military service. They were just making conversation or checking boxes in their mental assessment of her background. Morrison nodded absently, already losing interest. In his experience, most civilians who claimed military service had either served in non-combat roles or were exaggerating their experiences. The idea that the middle-aged woman running a hardware store might have seen more action than he had never occurred to him. Elena gathered the items on Morrison's list efficiently, her movements precise and economical. She'd learned to pack gear during her military service, and those skills translated well to organizing customer purchases. Morrison watched her work with the detached interest of someone observing a civilian attempting a task that seemed vaguely related to military procedures. "You know," Morrison said as Elena calculated the total, if you ever want to see how real shooting is done. We'll be setting up a range at the old airfield. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Might be educational for someone who's probably never seen military-grade marksmanship. Elena paused in her calculations, looking up at Morrison with an expression that didn't quite hide her amusement. "That's very kind of you to offer." "Just saying," Morrison continued, warming to his subject. "Most civilians think they know about shooting because they've maybe done some hunting or plinking at cans. But military precision is a whole different level. Takes years of training, the right mindset, discipline that most people can't understand." Corporal Chun joined the conversation from where he'd been examining a display of hunting rifles. "Sarge here is being modest. He's one of the best shots in the battalion. Qualified expert marksman 3 years running." Elena finished the calculations and announced the total. As Morrison counted out bills, she kept her expression neutral, but something in her posture had changed subtly. The relaxed demeanor of a helpful shopkeeper was being replaced by something more alert, more focused. "I'm sure you're very skilled," Elena said as she made change. "Marksmanship is definitely something that requires dedication and practice." Morrison accepted his change with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Maybe you should come watch sometime. Learn something about how professionals handle firearms. Might be useful for someone in your business." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable now. Elena had heard variations of this speech throughout her military career. Men who assumed that their gender, their rank, or their reputation automatically made them superior to anyone else handling a weapon. She'd learned to respond to such attitudes with patience and professionalism, but she'd also learned to remember exactly who had underestimated her. "I appreciate the invitation," Elena replied. "The range is at the old airfield?" "That's right. We'll be there most afternoons this week. Feel free to stop by if you want to see what real shooting looks like." After the Marines left, Elena stood behind her counter for several minutes, staring at the door they'd exited through. The encounter had been relatively brief and superficially polite, but it had awakened something in her that she'd kept carefully controlled for years. The casual dismissal, the assumption that she was just another civilian who couldn't possibly understand their world, the invitation to learn something from men who had no idea what she'd learned already. It all felt familiar and irritating. Elena had encountered plenty of attitudes like Morrison's during her military service. The assumption that women couldn't shoot, couldn't handle combat stress, couldn't measure up to male standards had been a constant undercurrent throughout her career. She'd responded by consistently outperforming expectations, earning respect through demonstrated competence rather than demanding it based on rank or rhetoric. But she'd also learned to pick her battles carefully, understanding that some people would never change their minds no matter what evidence they were presented with. The rest of Thursday passed quietly, with Elena helping customers with their usual needs and trying to focus on the routine tasks that normally brought her satisfaction. But Morrison's words kept echoing in her mind, particularly his casual assumption that she'd never seen real shooting, and his invitation to come learn from the professionals. By closing time, she'd made a decision that would have surprised anyone who knew her only as the patient hardware store owner. That evening, Elena drove to her house and went directly to her bedroom closet. Behind winter coats and unused formal wear, she retrieved a large locked case that she hadn't opened in over 2 years. Inside, wrapped in protective cloth and maintained with the care that proper weapons deserved, was her custom-built precision rifle. The weapon had been her companion through 3 deployments, a tool so familiar that she could disassemble and reassemble it in complete darkness. Elena spent an hour inspecting the rifle, checking the scope alignment, and running through the mental checklist that had once been second nature. The weapon was in perfect condition, as she'd known it would be. She'd never been able to abandon the maintenance habits that had kept her alive during her military service, even after years of civilian life, had made such precautions seem unnecessary. Friday morning brought a steady stream of customers, including several more Marines who'd apparently heard about the helpful hardware store from Morrison's group. Elena served them with the same professional courtesy she showed all her customers, but she noticed how they spoke to her politely but with the subtle condescension that suggested they saw her as a civilian who couldn't possibly understand their world. Corporal Santos spent 20 minutes explaining the differences between military-grade equipment and civilian alternatives while purchasing items that Elena could have recommended more efficiently. Private Brooks asked detailed questions about local hunting regulations while making comments about how military training made civilian hunting seem almost too easy. Each interaction reinforced Elena's growing sense that these young Marines had developed assumptions about civilian competence that needed to be challenged. By Friday afternoon, Elena had heard enough casual references to the Marines' shooting range and their superior military marksmanship to make her final decision. She closed the store 30 minutes early, went home to collect her rifle and gear, and drove to the abandoned airfield where the Marines had established their temporary base. The airfield had been built during World War II as a training facility, but it had been abandoned since the 1970s. The runway was still intact, though cracked and overgrown with weeds, and several of the old hangars remained standing. The Marines had set up their camp in the most defensible position, using the hangars for shelter and the open areas for training exercises. Elena could hear the sound of rifle fire before she could see the range set up. The Marines had established a firing line at one end of the runway, with targets placed at various distances down the length of the cracked asphalt. A small group of Marines were taking turns shooting while others observed and offered commentary. The atmosphere was relaxed and confident, with the easy camaraderie of soldiers who trusted each other's competence. Elena parked her truck at the edge of the airfield and sat for a moment, watching the Marines conduct their training. Part of her wondered if she was making a mistake, if she should simply drive away and let them continue believing whatever they wanted to believe about civilian capabilities. But another part of her, the part that had never backed down from a challenge during her military service, knew that some assumptions needed to be corrected. She retrieved her rifle case from the truck and walked toward the firing line. The Marines noticed her approach, and she could see them exchanging glances and quiet comments. By the time she reached the edge of their training area, most of the shooting had stopped and all attention was focused on the civilian woman carrying what was obviously a serious piece of equipment. Morrison was the first to approach her, his expression mixing curiosity with barely concealed amusement. "Ma'am, this is a restricted training area. I'm not sure civilians are supposed to be here." Elena set down her rifle case and looked around. The improvised range with the automatic assessment of someone who'd spent years evaluating shooting positions and field conditions. "I took you up on your invitation to see how real shooting is done. Thought I might learn something." Morrison's grin widened. "Well, I appreciate the interest, but this isn't really a spectator sport. We're conducting military training exercises." "I understand," Elena replied, kneeling to open her rifle case. "I was hoping I might be able to participate. Maybe learn from watching the professionals." The Marines who'd gathered around to watch this exchange began to chuckle. Elena could hear quiet comments about civilians who thought they understood military standards, about hardware store owners who'd probably never fired anything more challenging than a hunting rifle, about the difference between real marksmanship and whatever passed for shooting in civilian life. Morrison watched Elena remove her rifle from its case, and his expression shifted slightly. The weapon was clearly custom-built and professionally maintained, not the kind of equipment that casual shooters usually owned. But his assumptions about Elena's capabilities remained unchanged. "That's a nice rifle," Morrison acknowledged. "But I have to tell you, military marksmanship is a lot more challenging than most civilian shooting." We're not just plinking at targets here, we're training for combat situations where lives depend on precision. Elena finished assembling her rifle and looked up at Morrison with an expression that was perfectly polite, but somehow different from the patient demeanor she'd shown in her store. I understand the importance of precision shooting. What distances are you working with? Morrison gestured toward the targets placed at various points down the runway. We start at 300 yards for basic qualification, then move out to 500 and 800 yards for the more advanced stuff. Most of these guys can hit center mass at 300 yards consistently, and I can usually manage tight groupings at 500. Elena nodded, studying the range setup with increasing interest. The Marines had done a competent job establishing their firing positions, but she could see several ways the arrangement could be improved. The wind patterns around the old hangars would create unpredictable air currents at longer distances, and the afternoon sun would create heat shimmer that would affect accuracy at the extended ranges. Would it be possible for me to try a few shots? Elena asked. I'd like to see how my equipment performs compared to military standards. Morrison exchanged glances with his Marines, most of whom were now grinning openly. The idea of a middle-aged hardware store owner attempting to match military marksmanship was apparently the most entertaining thing that had happened during their training exercise. I suppose we could let you try a few rounds, Morrison said, his tone suggesting he was doing her a considerable favor. But I should warn you, these aren't civilian hunting conditions. Military shooting requires a different level of precision and discipline. Elena accepted a pair of safety glasses and ear protection, then moved to the firing line. She could feel the Marines watching her every movement, waiting for her to reveal her inexperience through poor weapon handling or improper shooting position. Instead, they watched her settle into a prone position with movements that were economical, precise, and obviously practiced. Elena's shooting position was textbook perfect, stable, comfortable, and designed for maximum accuracy. She adjusted her scope with the quick, confident movements of someone who understood her equipment intimately, then spent several minutes studying the wind conditions and calculating the factors that would affect her shots. The Marines' commentary gradually quieted as they realized that Elena's preparation was more thorough and professional than what they'd expected. I'll start with the 300-yard target, Elena announced, settling her cheek against the rifle stock. With the natural ease of someone who'd spent thousands of hours in this position. Morrison knelt beside her, ostensibly to offer guidance, but actually to observe her technique. He expected to see the hesitation, the overcorrection, the small mistakes that would reveal Elena's civilian status. Instead, he watched her breathing settle into the controlled rhythm that serious marksmen developed, saw her finger placement on the trigger that suggested extensive training, and noticed the way she seemed to become completely still and focused. Elena's first shot struck the 300-yard target just left of center, a result that was impressive for a civilian, but not particularly remarkable for someone with military training. The Marines nodded approvingly, making comments about beginner's luck and the advantages of expensive civilian equipment. Her second shot struck within an inch of the first, forming the beginning of a tight group that indicated consistent technique, rather than random accuracy. Morrison's expression became more serious as he realized that Elena's shooting was displaying the kind of precision that required significant training and practice. Elena's third shot struck between the first two, creating a group that would have been respectable for most military marksmen. Her fourth shot tightened the group further, and her fifth shot created a cluster that Morrison recognized as the kind of accuracy that separated skilled shooters from exceptional ones. Not bad for civilian equipment, Morrison commented, though. His tone lacked the condescension it had carried earlier. That's actually pretty decent shooting for someone without military training. Elena looked up from her rifle with an expression that might have been amusement. Thank you. Should I try the 500-yard target? Morrison hesitated. Elena's shooting At 300 yards had been genuinely impressive, but 500 yards was where the difference between civilian and military marksmanship usually became apparent. The longer distance required more precise calculations, better understanding of environmental factors, and the kind of consistent technique that only came from extensive training. "Sure," Morrison said finally. "But I should warn you, 500 yards is where things get challenging. The wind conditions are trickier, and the target appears much smaller. Most civilian shooters find it quite difficult." Elena adjusted her scope and spent several minutes studying the conditions at the longer distance. She could see the heat, shimmer rising from the asphalt, the way the wind was affecting the grass around the target, and the subtle environmental factors that would influence her shots. Her calculations were quick and precise, based on years of experience with similar conditions. Her first shot at 500 yards struck the target slightly high and right, a result that Morrison expected from someone attempting a distance that was beyond their usual experience. But Elena's adjustment was immediate and confident, suggesting she understood exactly what had caused the miss. Elena's second shot struck much closer to center, and her third shot was nearly perfect. Morrison found himself leaning forward to observe her technique more carefully, trying to understand how a civilian was achieving results that matched or exceeded what he'd seen from trained military marksmen. By the time Elena had fired her fifth shot at 500 yards, creating another impressively tight group, the Marines' commentary had stopped entirely. They were watching in silence as the hardware store owner demonstrated shooting skills that were clearly beyond what they'd expected from any civilian. "That's actually quite good," Morrison admitted, his professional assessment overriding his preconceptions. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Elena was already adjusting her scope for the 800-yard target, her movements confident and methodical. "I've always been interested in precision shooting. It's something that requires a lot of practice." Morrison watched her preparation for the long-distance shot with growing respect and curiosity. 800 yards was a distance that challenged even experienced military marksmen, requiring not just technical skill but deep understanding of ballistics, environmental factors, and the kind of mental discipline that came from extensive training. "Ma'am," Morrison said carefully, 800 yards is extremely challenging. Even with military training, it's not uncommon to miss completely at that distance, especially in these wind conditions. Elena finished her scope adjustments and settled into her shooting position. "I understand. I'd like to try anyway." The Marines gathered closer to observe Elena's attempt at the long-distance target. Morrison found himself genuinely curious about how she would perform, while his men remained skeptical that a civilian could achieve anything meaningful at such an extended range. Elena's first shot at 800 yards struck the target low and left, a result that seemed to confirm the Marines' expectations about civilian limitations at extended distances. But her second shot was dramatically closer to center, and her third shot was near perfect. Morrison felt his assumptions about Elena beginning to crumble as he watched her demonstrate the kind of consistent accuracy at 800 yards that he'd only seen from the most skilled military marksmen. Her technique was flawless, her equipment handling was professional, and her results were achieving standards that very few shooters could match. Elena's fourth shot at 800 yards created a group that Morrison recognized as exceptional marksmanship by any standard. Her fifth shot tightened the group further, creating a cluster that would have been impressive for a trained military sniper. The Marines had stopped making comments entirely, watching in silence as Elena demonstrated shooting skills that exceeded what most of them could achieve. Morrison found himself studying her technique with the attention of someone who recognized that he was observing something remarkable. "Ma'am," Morrison said quietly, "that's some of the finest shooting I've ever seen. Where exactly did you learn to do that?" Elena set down her rifle and looked up at Morrison with an expression that was no longer hiding her amusement. "I learned in the Army, Spent 12 years as sniper before I opened the hardware store. The silence that followed Elena's revelation was complete and profound. Morrison stared at her, trying to reconcile the middle-aged hardware store owner with the possibility that she was a trained military sniper. The other Marines looked between Elena and their sergeant, waiting for someone to respond to information that had completely changed their understanding of the situation. "You're telling me," Morrison said slowly, "that you're former military?" Elena nodded. 82nd Airborne, then Special Operations. 3 combat deployments, final rank of Staff Sergeant. I specialized in long-range precision shooting and counter-sniper operations. Morrison felt the world tilt slightly as he processed this information. He'd spent the better part of 2 days condescending to a woman who not only had military experience but had served in roles that were more specialized and demanding than his own. The casual invitation to come learn about real shooting took on an entirely different meaning when directed at someone who had probably forgotten more about marksmanship than he'd ever learned. "Why didn't you say anything?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying a mixture of embarrassment and genuine curiosity. Elena began packing her rifle with the same methodical care she'd shown throughout the demonstration. "You didn't ask. And honestly, most people aren't really interested in hearing about my military service. They see the hardware store owner, and that's enough for them." Morrison looked around at his Marines, all of whom were staring at Elena with expressions ranging from amazement to embarrassment. The woman they'd been treating as an amateur civilian had just demonstrated shooting skills that exceeded anything they'd achieved during their training exercises. "Staff Sergeant," Morrison said, unconsciously using Elena's former rank, "I owe you an apology. We made assumptions that were completely wrong." Elena finished packing her equipment and stood up, brushing dust from her jeans. "No apology necessary, Sergeant. You couldn't have known. But maybe next time, consider that people might have experiences and skills that aren't immediately obvious." Morrison felt the weight of the lesson Elena had just delivered. In 15 minutes of shooting, she demonstrated not just superior marksmanship but had revealed the dangers of making assumptions about people based on their appearance or current occupation. The hardware store owner had been a trained military sniper who'd chosen not to correct their misconceptions until action became necessary. "Ma'am," Morrison said, "would you be willing to share some of your experience with my Marines? We could learn a lot from someone with your background." Elena considered the request, looking at the young Marines who were now regarding her with the respect that her demonstrated competence had earned. "I might be able to help with some training, but I'm not looking to relive my military career. I've got a business to run." Morrison nodded, understanding that Elena had chosen civilian life deliberately and wasn't interested in being pulled back into military culture. "Of course. But if you're willing to share some techniques, we'd be grateful for the education." Elena spent the next hour working with Morrison's Marines, offering insights about long-range shooting that came from years of combat experience. She demonstrated techniques for reading wind patterns, calculating environmental factors, and maintaining accuracy under stress that went far beyond what they'd learned in basic marksmanship training. The Marines listened with the attention of students who discovered they were learning from a master. Elena's explanations were clear, practical, and based on experience that none of them could match. She corrected techniques that had been limiting their accuracy, explained principles that their previous training had only touched on, and demonstrated methods that immediately improved their performance. By the end of the session, Morrison's Marines were achieving better results than they'd managed during their entire training exercise. Elena's instruction had been efficient, professional, and remarkably effective. She'd transformed a group of confident young Marines into better marksmen, while simultaneously teaching them a lesson about assumptions and respect. As Elena prepared to leave, Morrison approached her with an expression of genuine admiration. "Staff Sergeant, I want to thank you for what you've done here today. You've taught us more than just shooting techniques." Elena smiled, and for the first time since entering the Marine camp, she looked completely relaxed. "Just remember that you never know who you're talking to. The person you're dismissing might be the person who could teach you the most." Morrison watched Elena drive away, her truck disappearing into the evening shadows. He stood there for several minutes, thinking about the assumptions he'd made and the lessons he'd learned. The hardware store owner had been a decorated military sniper who'd chosen to serve her community in a different way, and he'd nearly missed the opportunity to learn from her because of his preconceptions. The story of Elena's demonstration spread quickly through the Marine unit, and by the next day, it had become the kind of tale that would be told and retold for years. The details would probably change with each telling, but the essential lesson would remain: never assume you know someone's capabilities based on their appearance or current occupation. For Elena, the afternoon had been a reminder of skills she'd thought she'd left behind, and a confirmation that respect had to be earned through demonstrated competence rather than demanded based on assumptions. She'd spent years building a new identity as a helpful hardware store owner, but she'd also proven that her military skills remained sharp when circumstances required their use. The Marines completed their training exercise with a new understanding of the civilians they'd sworn to protect. Some of those civilians had served with distinction, had skills that exceeded their own, and had chosen different paths that didn't diminish their capabilities or their contributions. Elena returned to her routine of helping customers, managing inventory, and providing the kind of patient service that had made her hardware store a community institution. But now she carried the satisfaction of knowing that a group of young Marines had learned something important about assumptions, respect, and the diverse backgrounds of the people they served. The lesson would stay with Morrison and his Marines long after they returned to Camp Lejeune. They'd learned that expertise could be found in unexpected places, that civilian life attracted people with remarkable backgrounds, and that the most valuable lessons often came from sources they might have otherwise overlooked. Elena had proven that the hardware store lady was much more than she appeared to be, and in doing so, had reminded everyone involved that people are rarely as simple or as limited as they seem. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the fun-do people we least expect to teach us, and the most profound respect is earned through quiet competence rather than loud proclamation. The following Monday morning brought an unusual energy to Ridgeline Hardware. Word had spread through the small community of Millbrook about the events at the airfield, though the details had become increasingly embellished with each retelling. Some versions had Elena defeating an entire platoon of Marines in a shooting competition. Others claimed she'd been a Navy SEAL or Delta Force operative. The truth, as Elena well knew, was impressive enough without embellishment, but small towns had a way of turning interesting stories into local legends. Elena opened her store as she always did, arriving before dawn to organize inventory and prepare for the day ahead. She'd spent Sunday quietly, tending her garden and reading, deliberately avoiding the phone calls from curious neighbors who wanted to hear her version of what had happened at the Marine training site. She preferred to let the excitement die down naturally rather than feed it with additional details or explanations. The first customer of the day was Tom Hendricks, a local contractor who'd been buying supplies from Elena for over a decade. Tom was a practical man who appreciated Elena's knowledge and efficiency, but he'd clearly heard at least one version of the weekend's events and couldn't contain his curiosity. "Elena," Tom said as he approached the counter with a box of wood. "Screws. People are saying you showed up those Marines at their own shooting range. Is that true?" Elena smiled and rang up his purchase. "I went out to watch their training exercise and ended up doing some shooting myself. Nothing more dramatic than that." Tom studied her expression, looking for signs of the military background. That had apparently surprised everyone except Elena herself. "Word is you used to be Army. How come you never mentioned that before?" "Same reason you don't talk about your time as a roughneck in the oil fields. Elena replied. It's part of the past, not something that comes up in conversation about hardware. Supplies. Tom nodded, understanding the distinction between past experience and present identity. Still, must have felt good to show those young hotshots that civilians aren't all soft and ignorant. Elena finished processing his payment and handed him the receipt. They're good soldiers, Tom. They just needed to learn that military service doesn't end when someone takes off the uniform. There are a lot of veterans in civilian jobs who still remember their training. Tom left with his purchase and a new appreciation for Elena's background, but he wasn't the last customer to bring up the subject. Throughout the morning, Elena fielded questions from curious locals who wanted to know more about her military service, her shooting demonstration, and her thoughts about the Marine training exercise. She answered each inquiry politely but briefly, making it clear that she preferred to focus on the present rather than revisit the past. The atmosphere changed completely when Staff Sergeant Morrison entered the store shortly after lunch. He was alone this time, dressed in civilian clothes, and his demeanor was notably different from his previous visit. Gone was the casual arrogance and condescending tone. Instead, he approached Elena's counter with the respectful bearing of someone who'd learned an important lesson about assumptions and humility. "Ma'am," Morrison said, "I wanted to stop by and thank you properly for what you did Friday. You gave my Marines an education they won't forget." Elena looked up from the inventory sheet she'd been reviewing. "I hope it was helpful. You've got good soldiers there. They just needed to understand that shooting skills can come from unexpected sources." Morrison nodded, clearly still processing the events of the previous week. "I've been thinking about what happened, and I realize I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you an explanation for why we acted the way we did." Elena sat down her paperwork and gave Morrison her full attention. She'd dealt with enough military personnel over the years to recognize when someone was struggling with a lesson that challenged their fundamental assumptions about the world. "You don't owe me anything, Sergeant. You treated me the way most people treat civilians they don't know." "It's not personal." Morrison shook his head. "Maybe it should be personal. Maybe that's the problem. We've been trained to think of ourselves as different from civilians, better than civilians. We forget that most civilians used to be something else, including military." Elena recognized the internal conflict that Morrison was experiencing. She'd seen it in other young soldiers who'd built their identity around military superiority, only to discover that the civilian world contained people whose experience and capabilities exceeded their own. "The military teaches you to trust your unit, to rely on your training, and to take pride in your service," Elena said. "Those are good things. But sometimes that pride becomes arrogance, and that arrogance makes you blind to other people's strengths." Morrison leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. "When I saw you in here last week, I saw a hardware store owner, middle-aged woman, civilian clothes, small-town business. I didn't see a veteran. I didn't see someone who might have more combat experience than me." "Because I didn't want you to see that," Elena replied. "I've worked hard to build a life that isn't defined by my military service. When I'm helping someone find the right size bolt or explaining the difference between interior and exterior paint, I'm not Staff Sergeant Vasquez. I'm just Elena, the hardware store owner." Morrison nodded slowly. "But you're still both people. You didn't stop being a trained sniper when you became a business owner." "No," Elena agreed, "but I chose which identity to emphasize. Most of the time, the hardware store owner is more useful to my community than the former sniper." Morrison was quiet for several minutes, processing Elena's words and their implications. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new understanding of the complexity of civilian life and the diverse backgrounds of the people he'd sworn to protect. "My Marines have been talking about Friday ever since it happened. Not just about your shooting, but about the lesson you taught us. Some of them are embarrassed about how we acted. Others are amazed that someone with your background would choose to run a hardware store instead of staying in the military. Elena smiled. What do you think about it? Morrison considered the question carefully. I think I understand now. Why you chose civilian life. You found a way to serve people that doesn't require carrying a weapon or following orders. You help people build things instead of destroying them. That's part of it, Elena acknowledged. But I also found peace here. The military gave me skills and experiences that I'm grateful for, but it also gave me stress and memories that I needed to leave behind. This store, this community, this quiet life, it's healing in ways that continued military service couldn't have been. Morrison looked around the store, seeing it with new eyes. The organized shelves, the helpful signage, the careful attention to customer needs, it all reflected the same attention to detail and commitment to excellence that had made Elena an exceptional soldier. She'd simply redirected those qualities toward civilian service. The reason I came here today, Morrison said, is to ask if you'd be willing to help us with something. Not as a former soldier, but as someone who understands both military and civilian perspectives. Elena raised an eyebrow, curious about what Morrison had in mind. What kind of help? Morrison pulled out a folded paper from his pocket. We've got 3 more days left in our training exercise. My commanding officer wants us to do some community engagement activities, help local residents with projects, build relationships between the military and civilian communities. After what happened Friday, I think my Marines need to understand civilian life better. Elena unfolded the paper and saw a list of potential community service projects, helping elderly residents with home repairs, assisting local organizations with maintenance tasks, and participating in a community cleanup initiative. The list reflected genuine efforts to connect with civilian life, rather than simply performing military exercises in a civilian area. This looks like a good start, Elena said. But if you really want your Marines to understand civilian life, they need to do more than just help with projects. They need to listen to people's stories, learn about their backgrounds, understand that civilian life is more complex than they might think. Morrison nodded eagerly. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Would you be willing to coordinate some of these activities? Help us connect with people who could benefit from assistance, while also helping my Marines learn about the community. Elena considered the request carefully. Part of her wanted to decline, to maintain the separation between her military past and her civilian present. But another part of her recognized an opportunity to bridge the gap between military and civilian communities in a way that could benefit both sides. I could probably help with that, Elena said finally. But I have some conditions. Morrison leaned forward, ready to hear whatever terms Elena wanted to set. First, your Marines need to understand that they're guests in this community. They're here to help and to learn, not to demonstrate military superiority or to show civilians how things should be done. Morrison nodded. Understood. Second, they need to listen more than they talk. Every person they help has a story, has experiences, has knowledge that your Marines can learn from. This isn't about military personnel teaching civilians. It's about human beings connecting with other human beings. Agreed, Morrison said. Third, if any of your Marines show the same attitude they showed last week, the condescension, the assumptions about civilian capabilities, the arrangement ends immediately. I won't subject my neighbors to that kind of treatment. Morrison's expression became serious. That won't happen. I'll make sure of it. Elena studied Morrison's face, looking for signs that he truly understood what she was asking. She saw genuine commitment and a new humility that suggested Friday's lesson had been thoroughly absorbed. All right, Elena said. I'll help you set up some community service opportunities. But remember, this is about building bridges, not demonstrating military efficiency. Morrison smiled with obvious relief. Thank you, This means more than you know. Elena spent the next hour working with Morrison to identify specific projects and residents who could benefit from military assistance. She made phone calls to elderly neighbors who'd been struggling with home maintenance, contacted local organizations that needed help with facility repairs, and reached out to community leaders who could suggest additional opportunities for meaningful engagement. The list that emerged was diverse and practical. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow, needed help replacing rotted deckboards on her back porch. The community center required assistance moving heavy equipment for an upcoming event. The local veterans organization needed volunteers to help with their monthly food distribution program. Each project offered opportunities for meaningful interaction between Marines and civilians while addressing genuine community needs. "One more thing," Elena said as she handed Morrison the finalized list. "I want your Marines to know that they're working alongside civilians who may have military backgrounds. Don't assume that everyone they meet is a civilian without relevant experience." Morrison nodded, remembering his own assumptions about Elena's background. "How many veterans are we likely to encounter?" Elena considered the question. "In a community this size, probably more than you'd expect. We've got Vietnam veterans, Gulf War veterans, Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, and people who served during peacetime. Most of them don't advertise their military background, but that doesn't mean they don't have valuable experience and perspectives to share." Morrison left Elena's store with a new understanding of civilian communities and a detailed plan for meaningful military-civilian engagement. Elena watched him go, hoping that the lessons of Friday's shooting demonstration would translate into genuine respect and understanding during the upcoming community service projects. The next morning brought the first test of Morrison's commitment to changing his Marines' attitudes toward civilian engagement. Elena arrived at Mrs. Patterson's house at 8 o'clock to find Morrison and 3 of his Marines already there, studying the damaged deck and discussing repair strategies. Mrs. Patterson was 82 years old, a retired schoolteacher who'd lived in the same house for 40 years. Her husband had passed away 3 years earlier, leaving her to manage property maintenance tasks that had become increasingly difficult for her to handle alone. The deck repair was just one of several projects that she'd been unable to address due to physical limitations and financial constraints. Elena watched the Marines' interaction with Mrs. Patterson carefully, looking for signs of the condescension that had characterized their previous behavior. Instead, she observed young men who were listening respectfully to an elderly woman's explanations of her maintenance challenges and asking thoughtful questions about her needs and preferences. Corporal Chun was examining the rotted deckboards with careful attention, asking Mrs. Patterson about the history of the damage and her priorities for the repair. "Ma'am, it looks like these boards have been deteriorating for a while. Have you noticed any other areas of the deck that seem unstable?" Mrs. Patterson pointed to several additional problem spots, explaining how the damage had progressed over time and describing her concerns about safety and cost. Chun nodded thoughtfully, taking notes and asking follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine interest in understanding the full scope of the project. "We can definitely fix all of these areas," Chun said, "but I want to make sure we do it right the first time. Would it be helpful if we also treated the new boards to prevent future rot?" Elena smiled as she listened to Chun's respectful and thorough approach to the project. This was exactly the kind of civilian engagement she'd hoped to see. Military personnel using their skills to help community members while learning about civilian challenges and perspectives. Private Brooks was working with Morrison to measure the damaged boards and calculate material requirements. Elena overheard their conversation and was impressed by their attention to Mrs. Patterson's budget constraints and their efforts to find cost-effective solutions that would still provide lasting results. "If we use pressure-treated lumber for the replacement boards, it'll cost a little more upfront, but last much longer," Brooks explained to Mrs. Patterson. "But if budget is a concern, We can use standard lumber and apply preservative treatment ourselves. Mrs. Patterson considered the options carefully. What would you recommend for someone in my situation? Morrison answered thoughtfully. Honestly, I think the pressure-treated lumber is worth the extra cost. You don't want to have to do this repair again in a few years. We can help you find the materials at the best price. Elena appreciated Morrison's honest advice and his consideration of Mrs. Patterson's long-term needs. This was military expertise being applied to civilian problems in a way that respected both the technical requirements of the project and the personal circumstances of the person being helped. The Marines worked efficiently and professionally, completing the deck repair in less than 4 hours. But more importantly, they spent time talking with Mrs. Patterson about her experiences as a longtime community resident, her memories of the town's development over the decades, and her perspectives on the challenges facing elderly residents in all communities. Elena learned as much from these conversations as the Marines did. Mrs. Patterson had taught school for over 30 years, had raised 4 children who'd all served in the military at various times, and had been active in community organizations that had shaped Millbrook's development. She was a repository of local history and wisdom that the Marines began to appreciate as they listened to her stories. You know, Mrs. Patterson said as the Marines were cleaning up their tools, my youngest son served in the Marines for 8 years. Did tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He always said the hardest part of military service was coming home and figuring out how to connect with civilian life again. Morrison paused in his cleanup, interested in Mrs. Patterson's perspective. What did he say about that transition? Mrs. Patterson settled into a deck chair, clearly enjoying the opportunity to share her son's experiences. He said the military taught him to solve problems quickly and efficiently, but civilian problems were different. They required patience, compromise, and understanding of people's individual circumstances. Military solutions didn't always work in civilian situations. Elena watched Morrison process this insight, seeing him make connections between Mrs. Patterson's son's experience and his own assumptions about civilian life. The Marines had solved Mrs. Patterson's deck problem efficiently, but they'd also learned about the broader context of elderly residents' challenges, the importance of community connections, and the value of understanding individual circumstances. Your son sounds like he figured out how to bridge those two worlds, Chun observed. Mrs. Patterson smiled. He did eventually. But it took time and patience and a willingness to admit that civilian life was more complicated than he'd expected. He learned to listen more and assume less. The parallel to the Marines' own learning process was obvious, and Elena could see that the lesson wasn't lost on any of them. They'd come to Millbrook thinking they understood civilian life, but they were discovering that civilian communities contained complexities and challenges that military training hadn't prepared them for. The afternoon brought a different kind of challenge when the Marines joined Elena at the community center to help with equipment setup for an upcoming event. The center served as a hub for various local organizations, and the Marines found themselves working alongside volunteers from different backgrounds and age groups. Elena introduced the Marines to the center's coordinator, David Kim, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who managed the facility's operations and organized community events. Kim welcomed the Marines warmly, but without the deference that they might have expected from civilian administrators. We appreciate the help, Kim said as he showed them the equipment that needed to be moved. This stuff is heavy and awkward, and most of our regular volunteers are older folks who can't handle the physical demands. The Marines began moving tables, chairs, and sound equipment with the efficient teamwork that their military training had instilled. But as they worked, they found themselves in conversation with other volunteers who were preparing for the event, and these interactions provided new insights into civilian community engagement. Elena watched Corporal Santos work alongside Martha Rodriguez, a local nurse who volunteered at the community center during her off hours. Santos had initially assumed that Martha's medical background was limited to civilian healthcare, but as they worked together, he learned that she'd served as a Navy corpsman before transitioning to civilian nursing. How did you make the transition from military to civilian healthcare? Santos asked as they arranged chairs for the upcoming meeting. Martha smiled. It was challenging at first. Military medicine is focused on trauma care and immediate response. Civilian healthcare involves longer-term patient relationships, family dynamics, and a lot more paperwork. But the core skills translated well. Santos nodded, beginning to understand that civilian careers often built on military experience in ways he hadn't considered. Do you miss the military environment? Sometimes, Martha admitted. I miss the clarity of mission and the strong team bonds, but I love the continuity of civilian healthcare. I get to see patients recover completely, watch families heal together, and build relationships that last for years. It's a different kind of service, but it's still service. Elena appreciated Martha's perspective and the way it was helping Santos understand that civilian life could be as meaningful and challenging as military service. The conversation was exactly the kind of bridge building that she'd hoped to facilitate. Meanwhile, Morrison was working with Jim Thompson, an elderly man who volunteered with the center's veterans program. Jim moved slowly and spoke quietly, and Morrison initially assumed he was simply an elderly civilian who supported military causes. It wasn't until they'd worked together for an hour that Jim mentioned his own military background. I served in Vietnam, Jim said casually as they moved a heavy table. Army, 101st Airborne, did 13 months in country. Morrison stopped moving the table and looked at Jim with new attention. Vietnam? What was your MOS? Infantry, Jim replied. Door gunner on helicopters for most of my tour. Saw a lot of action, lost a lot of friends. Came home to a country that didn't much want to hear about it. Morrison realized he was talking to a combat veteran whose experience was more extensive and challenging than his own. Jim's quiet demeanor and elderly appearance had hidden a military background that included combat service in one of America's most controversial wars. How did you handle the transition back to civilian life? Morrison asked, genuinely curious about Jim's experience. Jim paused in his work, considering the question carefully. Poorly, at first. I was angry, confused, and felt like nobody understood what we'd been through. Took me years to figure out that civilian life wasn't the enemy. It was just different. Morrison found himself listening to Jim's story with the same attention he'd give to a military briefing. Jim's experience offered insights into the long-term challenges of military-civilian transition that Morrison had never considered. What helped you eventually adjust? Morrison asked. Jim smiled. Time mostly. And finding ways to serve that. Didn't require a uniform. This place, he gestured around the community center, lets me help veterans who are going through the same transitions I went through. I can't solve their problems, but I can listen and share what I've learned. Elena overheard this conversation and recognized its value for Morrison's understanding of veteran transitions and civilian service. Jim represented the kind of quiet, ongoing community engagement that many veterans found after leaving military. Service meaningful work that built on military experience while serving civilian needs. As the afternoon progressed, Elena watched the Marines interact with volunteers from diverse backgrounds and discover the complexity of civilian community engagement. They met retired teachers who developed organizational skills that rivaled military logistics, business owners who'd learned leadership through civilian challenges, and community activists who dedicated their lives to service without ever wearing a uniform. Each interaction challenged the Marines' assumptions about civilian capabilities and commitment. They began to understand that civilian life contained its own forms of discipline, sacrifice, and service that were different from military experience, but equally valid and valuable. The day's final project took the Marines to the local veterans organization for their monthly food distribution program. Elena had specifically chosen this assignment because it would put the Marines in direct contact with veterans from different eras and branches of service, providing opportunities for intergenerational military dialogue while serving community needs. The Veterans Organization occupied a modest building that had been donated by a local business owner who was himself a veteran. The facility served as a meeting place for veteran support groups, a distribution center for assistance programs, and a social hub for former military personnel who were adjusting to civilian life. Elena introduced the Marines to Frank Wilson, the organization's president and a Gulf War veteran who'd organized the food distribution program after recognizing the needs of struggling veteran families in the community. Frank welcomed the Marines, but made it clear that they were there to help, not to lead. "We've been running this program for 3 years," Frank explained as he showed them the operation. "We get food donations from local businesses and distribute them to veteran families who are having trouble making ends meet. It's not charity, it's veterans helping veterans." Morrison and his Marines found themselves working alongside volunteers who represented decades of military service across multiple branches and conflicts. There was Sarah Chun, an Air Force veteran who'd served in logistics and now coordinated the program supply chain. Robert Jackson, a Marine veteran from the 1980s who'd become a social worker and now helped identify families in need. Maria Santos, an Army veteran who'd served in Afghanistan and now worked as a counselor helping other veterans adjust to civilian life. Elena watched the young Marines interact with these older veterans and saw the immediate recognition of shared military culture combined with growing appreciation for civilian applications of military skills. The conversations that developed were different from typical military interactions. They included military experiences but also addressed civilian challenges, family responsibilities, and community engagement. Corporal Brooks found himself working with Robert Jackson to organize food packages for distribution. Jackson's approach was methodical and efficient, but it also incorporated personal knowledge of each family's specific needs and preferences. "This family has 3 kids under 10, Jackson explained as they prepared a package. "The father is a disabled vet who's having trouble finding work that accommodates his injuries. The mother works part-time, but it's not enough to cover everything. They need kid-friendly foods and things that are easy to prepare." Brooks nodded, impressed by Jackson's attention to individual circumstances. "How do you keep track of all these details?" Jackson smiled. "Same way I kept track of my Marines when I was on active duty. You pay attention to your people. You learn what they need, and you make sure they get it. The only difference is that now my people are veteran families instead of active duty Marines." Brooks began to understand that Jackson was applying military leadership principles to civilian community service. The skills were the same: attention to detail, care for subordinates, mission focus, but the context and objectives were different. Meanwhile, Morrison was working with Maria Santos to coordinate deliveries to families who couldn't come to the distribution center. Santos had developed a network of volunteers who made home visits, and she was explaining the challenges of reaching veterans who were isolated or struggling with mental health issues. "A lot of these guys are proud," Santos explained as they loaded packages into her car. "They don't want to admit they need help, and they don't want to feel like charity cases. We have to approach them as fellow veterans offering mutual support, not as people providing assistance to people who can't take care of themselves." Morrison recognized the pride Santos was describing. He'd seen it in fellow Marines who'd struggled with various challenges but refused to ask for help. "How do you get through to them?" Santos considered the question. "Patience, mostly. And understanding that their resistance comes from strength, not weakness. These are people who've served their country, who've been trained to be self-reliant and mission-focused. Accepting help feels like failure to them." Morrison found himself thinking about his own assumptions about civilian life and the possibility that some of his attitudes toward civilian capabilities were actually defensive mechanisms designed to protect military identity and pride. The key, Santos continued, is helping them understand that accepting support from fellow veterans isn't failure, it's part of continuing to serve. We're all still part of the same mission. We're just serving in different capacities now. Elena listened to these conversations with satisfaction, recognizing that the Marines were gaining exactly the kind of understanding she'd hoped to facilitate. They were learning that military values and skills could be successfully applied to civilian challenges, that veteran transitions involved continuing service in new forms, and that civilian life was more complex and demanding than they'd previously understood. As the evening wound down and the food distribution was completed, the Marines gathered with the veteran volunteers for a brief informal discussion. Elena had encouraged this conversation as an opportunity for the young Marines to ask questions about civilian transitions and for the older veterans to share insights about long-term military career perspectives. Frank Wilson initiated the discussion by asking the Marines about their own plans for eventual civilian transition. You guys are all young, probably planning to make careers out of the military. But eventually, most of you will face the choice between staying in for 20 or 30 years or getting out and starting civilian careers. Have you thought about what comes after the Marines? Morrison answered for his group. Honestly, we've been so focused on our current assignments that we haven't thought much about civilian life. This week has been eye-opening. Sarah Chun smiled. That's normal. When I was your age, I couldn't imagine being anything other than Air Force. Civilian life seemed boring and meaningless compared to military service. It took me a while to understand that civilian life could be just as challenging and rewarding as military service. Robert Jackson nodded in agreement. The transition is harder than most people expect. Not just the practical stuff like finding jobs and housing, but the identity shift. You go from being a Marine or a soldier to being just another civilian. That can be tough on the ego. Maria Santos added her perspective. But you also discover freedoms and opportunities that military life doesn't offer. You can choose where to live, what kind of work to do, how to spend your time. You can build relationships and pursue interests that military structure doesn't always accommodate. Elena watched the Marines absorb these perspectives, seeing them process information about civilian life that challenged their assumptions about post-military possibilities. The conversation was helping them understand that civilian transition wasn't about abandoning military values, but about applying those values in new contexts. Morrison asked the question that Elena had been hoping someone would raise. How do you maintain the sense of purpose and mission that military service provides? How do you find meaning in civilian life? Frank Wilson leaned forward, recognizing the importance of the question. You create it. You find ways to serve that match your skills and interests. For some people, that means careers in law enforcement, emergency services, or government. For others, it means starting businesses, teaching, or working in healthcare. The key is understanding that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. Jim Thompson, who'd been quiet during most of the discussion, spoke up. You also learn that civilian life has its own forms of courage and sacrifice. Raising children, caring for elderly parents, building communities, standing up for principles in the workplace. These things require different kinds of strength than military service, but they're no less important. Elena saw the Marines considering these perspectives, beginning to understand that civilian life contained challenges and opportunities that were different from military service, but equally significant. The conversation was helping them develop more nuanced and respectful views of civilian capabilities and contributions. As the Marines prepared to leave, Frank Wilson made a final observation that would stay with them long after their training exercise ended. You guys have been great this week. You've shown respect for our community, you've worked hard, and you've listened to what people have told you. That's exactly the kind of civilian engagement that builds trust between military and civilian communities. Morrison responded with genuine appreciation. We've learned more this week than we expected. You've all taught us that civilian life is more complex and meaningful than we understood. Elena felt satisfied with the week's outcomes as she watched the Marines interact with the veteran volunteers. The young Marines had discovered that civilian communities contained people with diverse backgrounds, valuable skills, and meaningful contributions to society. They'd learned that military values could be successfully applied to civilian challenges, and that veteran transitions involved continuing service in new forms, rather than abandoning military principles. The community service projects had achieved their intended goals of helping local residents while building understanding between military and civilian communities. But more importantly, they'd challenged assumptions, created connections, and demonstrated that mutual respect and learning were possible when people approached each other with open minds and genuine interest in understanding different perspectives. As Elena drove home that evening, she reflected on the week's events and their broader implications. The Marines had arrived in Millbrook with typical military attitudes toward civilian life: respectful but condescending, helpful but superior, willing to serve but convinced of their own exceptional capabilities. They were leaving with more nuanced understanding of civilian complexities, appreciation for diverse forms of service, and respect for the skills and experiences that people brought to their communities regardless of their military background. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or sudden. It had been the result of patient engagement, meaningful work, and honest conversations between people who'd approached each other with curiosity rather than judgment. Elena had facilitated the process, but the learning had been mutual. The Marines had gained new perspectives on civilian life, while the community members had gained new appreciation for the young men and women who served in the military. The week had also reinforced Elena's own sense of purpose and identity. She'd successfully bridged her military past and civilian present, using her experience and skills to create understanding between two communities that sometimes struggled to connect with each other. She'd proven to herself that her choice to leave military service hadn't been about abandoning her commitment to service, but about finding new ways to contribute to the welfare of others. Most importantly, the week had demonstrated that assumptions about people's capabilities and backgrounds were often wrong and always limiting. Elena had learned as much about her own community as the Marines had, discovering stories and experiences among her neighbors that she'd never known about. The hardware store owner, the nurse, the teacher, the social worker, the community volunteers all had backgrounds and skills that were more complex and impressive than their current roles might suggest. The lesson applied equally to military and civilian communities. People were rarely as simple or as limited as they appeared, and the most valuable relationships were built on curiosity, respect, and willingness to learn rather than assumptions about superiority or inferiority. Elena had spent the week teaching that lesson to a group of young Marines, but she'd also learned it herself through interactions with neighbors whose stories had surprised and impressed her. The final day of the Marine training exercise arrived, with an unexpected development that would cement the lessons learned throughout the week. Elena received a phone call at 6 a.m. from Colonel Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer overseeing the Millbrook training deployment. Colonel had received reports about her Marines' community engagement activities and wanted to see the results firsthand. Elena arrived at Ridgeline Hardware to find Colonel Hayes waiting in the parking lot, accompanied by Staff Sergeant Morrison and a military photographer who was documenting the training exercise for official reports. Hayes was a career officer with 30 years of service, and her presence immediately elevated the significance of what had been a local community engagement project. "Ms. Vasquez," Colonel Hayes said, extending her hand with military precision, "I understand you've been instrumental in organizing community service opportunities for my Marines. I wanted to thank you personally and see some of the work they've accomplished." Elena shook the colonel's hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that characterized senior military officers. "They've been excellent volunteers, Colonel. Your Marines have made real contributions to our community this week." Colonel Hayes studied Elena with the assessing gaze of someone trained to evaluate personnel quickly and accurately. "Staff Sergeant Morrison tells me you have military background yourself. He mentioned that you provided some marksmanship instruction that was quite valuable." Elena glanced at Morrison, who looked slightly nervous about how his commanding officer might react to the story of their shooting demonstration. "I did some shooting with them, yes. They're skilled marksmen who were willing to learn from someone with different experience." Colonel Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Different experience? What was your military occupation specialty, if you don't mind me asking?" Elena hesitated briefly, then decided that honest disclosure was preferable to awkward evasion. "Sniper, Colonel. 82nd Airborne and Special Operations. 12 years active duty." The colonel's expression shifted immediately, showing the recognition of someone who understood the significance of Elena's military background. "Staff Sergeant Morrison mentioned marksmanship instruction, but he didn't mention that you were Special Operations qualified. That changes the context considerably." Morrison looked uncomfortable, realizing that he'd significantly understated Elena's credentials when briefing his commanding officer. "Ma'am, I thought it was more important to focus on the community engagement aspects of the training." Colonel Hayes studied Morrison for a moment, then turned back to Elena. "Would you be willing to show me some of the community projects my Marines have been working on? I'd like to see the results of this community engagement initiative." Elena spent the next 2 hours driving Colonel Hayes, Morrison, and the photographer around Millbrook, visiting the sites where Marines had provided assistance throughout the week. At each location, they found evidence of professional, thorough work that had made meaningful differences in people's lives. Mrs. Patterson's deck repair had been completed with attention to detail that exceeded her expectations. The new boards were perfectly fitted, properly sealed, and built to last for decades. More importantly, Mrs. Patterson spoke enthusiastically about the respectful, helpful attitude of the Marines who'd done the work. "Those young men listened to everything I told them about the problems I'd been having," Mrs. Patterson explained to Colonel Hayes. "They didn't just fix what was broken, they anticipated future problems and addressed those too. And they took time to talk with me, to hear my stories about the community and my family's military service." Colonel Hayes nodded approvingly, recognizing that the Marines had provided more than just manual labor. They'd engaged with Mrs. Patterson as a person with valuable experiences and perspectives, treating her as someone worthy of respect rather than simply someone who needed help. The community center visit provided similar evidence of Marines who'd approached civilian engagement with genuine interest and professionalism. David Kim showed Colonel Hayes the equipment setup that had been completed efficiently and safely, but he emphasized the positive interactions between Marines and community volunteers. "Your Marines worked alongside our regular volunteers as equals," Kim explained. "They didn't try to take over or show us how military efficiency could improve our operations. They integrated into our existing systems and made everything work better." Colonel Hayes was particularly interested in Kim's description of conversations between Marines and veteran volunteers. The intergenerational military dialogue had created connections between active duty personnel and veterans that bridged different eras of service and different approaches to civilian transition. The visit to the Veterans Organization provided the most significant evidence of successful military-civilian engagement. Frank Wilson had prepared a brief presentation about the food distribution program and the Marines' contributions, but the real impact was visible in the testimonials from veteran families who'd been helped during the week. "Your Marines didn't just move boxes and organize supplies," Frank explained to Colonel Hayes. They listened to our veteran stories, asked thoughtful questions about civilian transitions, and showed genuine interest in understanding the challenges that veterans face after leaving military service. Colonel Hayes spent considerable time talking with the veteran volunteers, hearing their perspectives on military-civilian relations and their assessments of the young Marines' attitudes and performance. The feedback was consistently positive, emphasizing respect, professionalism, and genuine interest in learning about civilian life. Maria Santos, the Army veteran who worked in veteran counseling, provided particularly insightful observations. These Marines came here with typical active-duty attitudes about civilian life, respectful, but somewhat condescending. By the end of the week, they were asking serious questions about their own eventual transitions and showing real appreciation for the complexity of civilian challenges. Colonel Hayes recognized the value of Santos's assessment. Military personnel who understood civilian life were more effective at military-civilian cooperation, more successful in their own eventual transitions, and more capable of representing the military positively in civilian communities. After visiting all the community service sites, Colonel Hayes asked Elena to accompany her back to the Marine base camp for a final meeting with all the Marines who'd participated in the community engagement activities. Elena agreed, curious about how the colonel would address the week's lessons with her personnel. The meeting took place in one of the old hangars at the abandoned airfield, with all 24 Marines assembled in formation. Colonel Hayes had Elena stand beside her as she addressed the unit, a gesture that immediately signaled Elena's importance to whatever message the colonel intended to deliver. "Marines," Colonel Hayes began, "you've completed a week of community engagement that has exceeded my expectations. You've provided valuable assistance to civilian residents. You've represented the Marine Corps with honor, and you've learned lessons that will make you better Marines and better citizens." The Marines stood at attention, listening to their commanding officer's assessment with the focused attention that military discipline required. Elena could see some of them glancing in her direction, obviously curious about why she was present for this military ceremony. But more importantly, Colonel Hayes continued, "You've learned that civilian life is more complex and challenging than you previously understood. You've discovered that many civilians have military backgrounds and valuable skills that aren't immediately obvious. You've seen that service doesn't end when someone takes off the uniform." Colonel Hayes paused, letting her words register with the assembled Marines before continuing with the specific lesson she wanted to emphasize. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez, who organized your community service opportunities, is a former special operations sniper with 12 years of military service and 3 combat deployments. Her military experience exceeds that of most of you, but she chose to serve her community as a business owner rather than continuing her military career." Elena watched the Marines process this information, seeing recognition dawn on faces of those who remembered their initial dismissive attitudes toward the hardware store owner. The lesson was clear. Assumptions about civilian capabilities based on appearance or occupation were often completely wrong. "The lesson here," Colonel Hayes continued, "is that you never know who you're talking to. The civilian who seems ordinary might be a decorated veteran. The person you think needs your help might be someone who could teach you valuable lessons. Respect isn't something you grant based on uniforms or titles. It's something you show to everyone until they prove they don't deserve it." Colonel Hayes then asked Elena to address the Marines directly, giving her the opportunity to share her own perspectives on military-civilian relations and the lessons of the past week. Elena stepped forward, looking at the young Marines who'd gone from dismissing her as a small-town civilian to respecting her as a fellow veteran with valuable experience. Her message was simple but important. "You're all going to face civilian transitions eventually," Elena said. "Some of you will retire from military service. Others will complete your enlistments and choose civilian careers. When that time comes, remember this week. Remember that civilian life has its own challenges, its own forms of service, and its own opportunities for meaningful contribution. Elena paused, making eye contact with Morrison and the other Marines, who'd participated in her initial shooting demonstration. Remember that the skills and values the military taught you can be successfully applied to civilian challenges. Leadership, teamwork, attention to detail, commitment to excellence. These qualities are just as valuable in civilian life as they are in military service. But remember also that civilians have their own skills, experiences, and perspectives that you can learn from. Elena's final point addressed the broader implications of military-civilian relations. Most importantly, remember that military service is about protecting and serving civilian communities. You can't effectively serve people you don't respect or understand. This week, you've learned that civilian communities deserve your respect. Not because they need your protection, but because they're complex, capable, and valuable in their own right. Colonel Hayes concluded the ceremony by announcing that the Millbrook Community Engagement Initiative would be used as a model for future training exercises. The success of the week's activities had demonstrated the value of meaningful military-civilian interaction that went beyond simple community service to include genuine dialogue and mutual learning. After the ceremony, Colonel Hayes asked Elena to join her for a private conversation about the broader implications of the week's success. They walked to a quiet area away from the Marine camp, where the colonel could speak more freely about her observations and plans. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, Colonel Hayes began, what you've accomplished this week goes beyond simple community relations. You've given my Marines an education in civilian life that will make them better soldiers and better citizens. Elena appreciated the colonel's recognition but wanted to emphasize the mutual benefits of the week's activities. Your Marines gave our community valuable assistance, Colonel. The learning went both directions. Colonel Hayes nodded. That's exactly what I observed. Real engagement between military and civilian communities benefits everyone involved. My Marines learned respect for civilian capabilities, and your community gained appreciation for military service and values. The colonel then made a proposal that surprised Elena completely. I'd like to invite you to consider returning to military service as a civilian contractor. We need people with your background and skills to help develop training programs that prepare military personnel for civilian engagement. What you've done here could be replicated at bases across the country. Elena considered the offer carefully, recognizing both its potential value and its implications for her chosen civilian life. I appreciate the offer, Colonel, but I've built a life here that I'm not ready to leave. My community depends on my business, and I've found peace in civilian service. Colonel Hayes accepted Elena's decision with understanding. I expected that answer, but I had to ask. However, would you be willing to consult on developing training materials that other communities could use for similar programs? Elena found this compromise much more appealing. I could probably help with that. The key is understanding that military-civilian engagement has to be based on mutual respect and genuine interest in learning from each other. Colonel Hayes agreed enthusiastically. Exactly. Too many military-civilian programs focus on military personnel helping civilians, without recognizing that civilians have valuable knowledge and experience to share with military personnel. They spent another hour discussing the specifics of successful military-civilian engagement, the lessons learned during the Millbrook exercise, and the potential for developing similar programs at other military installations. Elena agreed to help develop training materials that could be used by other units conducting civilian engagement exercises. As the Marine unit prepared to depart Millbrook, Elena reflected on the transformations that had occurred during their week-long stay. The Marines had arrived with typical military assumptions about civilian life and had departed with more nuanced understanding of civilian challenges, capabilities, and contributions to society. Morrison approached Elena as the Marines were loading their equipment for departure. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez, I want to thank you again for everything you've taught us this week. You've changed how I think about civilian life and military service." Elena shook Morrison's hand, recognizing the genuine respect that had replaced his initial condescension. "Just remember what you've learned here, Sergeant. Apply it when you're dealing with civilian communities in the future, and share it with other Marines who might benefit from understanding civilian perspectives." Morrison nodded seriously. "I will, and I'll never again assume that someone's current job tells me everything I need to know about their background and capabilities." Elena watched the Marines depart, knowing that they were carrying lessons about respect, assumptions, and the complexity of civilian life that would influence their future interactions with non-military communities. The week had been successful beyond her initial expectations, creating understanding and connections that would benefit both military and civilian communities long after the training exercise ended. The aftermath of the Marine visit brought Elena a new appreciation for her own dual identity as a veteran and civilian community member. She'd successfully bridged her military past and civilian present, using her experience and skills to create understanding between communities that sometimes struggled to connect with each other. More importantly, Elena had demonstrated to herself that her choice to leave military service hadn't been about abandoning her commitment to service, but about finding new ways to contribute to the welfare of others. The hardware store provided daily opportunities to help people solve problems and complete projects, while her military experience remained available when circumstances required its application. The story of Elena's week with the Marines spread throughout Millbrook and beyond, becoming an example of successful military-civilian engagement that emphasized mutual respect and learning. But for Elena, the most satisfying outcome was the continuation of her quiet civilian life, enriched by the knowledge that she'd helped a group of young Marines develop better understanding of the communities they'd sworn to protect. Elena returned to her routine of opening Ridgeline Hardware each morning, helping customers find the supplies they needed, and providing the kind of patient, knowledgeable service that had made her business a community institution. But now she carried the additional satisfaction of knowing that her military service and civilian life had combined to create something valuable and lasting. The old photograph of Elena in military uniform remained on the shelf behind her counter, usually obscured by paperwork and inventory lists. Most customers still saw only the helpful hardware store owner, and Elena preferred it that way. But now she also knew that when circumstances required it, she could successfully bridge the gap between military and civilian worlds, using her experience and skills to create understanding and respect between communities that needed each other's support. Elena had proven that service takes many forms, that assumptions about people's capabilities are often wrong, and that the most valuable lessons often come from unexpected sources. The Marines had learned those lessons. The community had benefited from their assistance, and Elena had discovered new ways to apply her military experience to civilian challenges. The week had reinforced Elena's belief that people are rarely as simple or as limited as they appear, and that meaningful relationships are built on curiosity, respect, and willingness to learn rather than assumptions about superiority or inferiority. It was a lesson that applied equally to military and civilian communities, and one that would continue to influence Elena's interactions with everyone who entered her store, looking for more than just hardware supplies. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.